So if you haven't seen it, I hope that you have, but if you haven't, you can still see it on Film Forum until the end of the month. And we can put that link in the chat before this is over. But if you've signed up, you probably have received a discount code. So you should be able to watch it Film Forum with that discount code, or starting in February, you will be able to stream the film. Is that right, David?
It'll be available for like downloads in mid-February. Yeah.
Great. Um, so the film follows the mayor of Ramallah, Musa Hadid, uh, during the beginning of December. It appears into 2017, around the time that the Trump administration moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the American embassy to Jerusalem. And the film really gives a sense of the everyday life in Ramallah from the perspective of the person who's really trying to keep it together, keep the services, getting services to the people. And so I want to introduce you first, and then we'll talk a little bit. I'll ask some questions. So David Osit is a director, editor, and composer. His previous film was the Emmy Award-winning feature documentary, Thank You for Playing, which premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. It's a beautiful film. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. David is an alumnus of the Berlinale Talents and the Sundance Nonfiction Directors Lab. So thanks, David.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start just with a basic question of how you encountered the mayor of Ramallah and how you decided to make the film about him, and also particularly whether you kind of knew that you were going to follow him during this really critical moment in the history of Palestine and in the West Bank, or whether you filmed for sort of a longer period of time and zeroed in on this time frame after the fact.
Sure. Well, to start with, I worked off and on in the Middle East for around a decade. And before I got into film, I was studying refugee law in Cairo and was on track to do that for a living. But eventually I got into filmmaking and for a while was working as an editor and got a job doing an edit for a Palestinian director's documentary. The film was called Off Frame. And so I was editing that film in Ramallah. And it had been a few years since I'd been there. And I think this was 2016 or 17, maybe 2015 actually. And I was really struck by how much the city had changed to me. It seemed like all of a sudden there were hipster bars and nightclubs and free unlimited public Wi-Fi and a Jaguar dealership. And it was around the Christmas season. And so a lot of Christmas stuff was being set up. And I remember asking a Palestinian friend of mine, why is Christmas such a big deal here? And he looked at me like I was a bit slow and said, well, you know, Jesus was born like right over there. He's a hometown guy. And I remember mostly just feeling, wow, I'm so surprised that I'm surprised. You know, here I am, someone who arguably knows more than the average American about the Middle East, about Palestine, got my degree in Middle Eastern and North African studies, you know, but still couldn't help the fact that I was basically, just as an American, bringing the sort of monolithic, one-dimensional understanding of this part of the world with me, and had these blinders up that continued to tell me what a Palestinian city should look like. And Ramallah really defies that pretty adamantly, just by its nature. And it's also a city of incredible complexity and juxtaposition. So I really fell in love with the city and had an incredible time there and kind of filed that away. But then a year later, we finished the film. We screened it in Brooklyn, where I live, at the Museum of Moving Image. And the director, Muhammad, came to New York, and he was staying with me. And I remember one night just asking him, hey, Muhammad, out of curiosity, what's the mayor of Ramallah like? And he was like, oh, you know, he's a really charismatic guy. He's very charming, very funny. You'll always see him walking around town with his e-cigarette. And and he's Christian, and he's like, the mayor has to be Christian. He told me it's like an old Ottoman law. And I remember all these light bulbs started going off in my head, just being like, I'm so curious what his job is like. And the films I make are really compelled more so by questions than by anything else. I don't really have an interest in making a film where I know what the film's going to be, but I am very interested in making films where I know what the questions are that I want to ask. And the film itself feels like that's the answer. And in this case, this question, like a balloon for me, was, how do you run a city when you don't have a country? How do you run a city under an occupation? And I didn't know the answer, and I was very curious just to see what his job was like and how he worked, and to meet him. So I got a meeting with him and went to his office, pitched the idea to him. I walked into his office and he was on the phone with one of his constituents. I sat down on the couch that you see a couple times in the film, and he was wrapping up a phone call and he was talking to one of his constituents saying, listen, I can't get you out of parking tickets. Stop calling me. I'm the mayor. I'm not the chosen one. I can't do everything. And I remember thinking to myself, this is exactly what I was expecting in some way. And that's what excites me about this. Um, and I told him what I wanted to do with the film. And of course, at that point, I had no idea that Trump would move the embassy, that this would be one of the most tumultuous periods in recent history in Palestine. I didn't know that. What I did know is that I wanted to make a film about local government and all the absurdity, and through the absurdity, the profundity that comes from this question of how do you run the city without a country, and just exploring that question, knowing that certain things would seep inside of the frame related to the occupation, but not quite knowing to what extent, until that happened on day 5, actually.
So that happened on day 5 of you being there.
Yeah.
So in a sense, you kind of, I mean, I wouldn't want to say you got lucky because it was a very difficult period, but as far as the film, in terms of your shooting schedule.
I knew there is always there's always something, as Gilda Radner would say. I feel like there's always like something that's going to happen when it comes to the way the occupation kind of inserts itself into the frame, and in this very narrow scope. I was at the outset thinking, I wanted to do something about what I felt to me was an issue in representation with films about Palestine. I feel like there's a couple different kinds of movies that Westerners or non-Palestinians make. One is trading in this idea that Palestinians are religious zealots and terrorists, which I don't agree with politically or personally. And then the other idea is that Palestinians are one-dimensional victims. And you'll see a lot of films, particularly by Israeli filmmakers. Some of these films are great films, and I'm talking about documentaries mostly. Some of these are great films, but they are generally focusing on Israeli guilt, the complex emotional response that Israelis feel when it comes to reckoning with the occupation. And given that, the Palestinian characters become footnotes, they become one-dimensional proxies through which Israelis explore their own stuff. And in both those cases, in both those kinds of films, there's a real limit on what we can talk about when it comes to Palestinian lives, what we can talk about when it comes to Palestinian agency, how agency is stripped by a colonial enterprise. That was really interesting to me, and I hadn't seen it done before. I've seen it done by Palestinian filmmakers making fiction films, but I hadn't seen it in a documentary coming from the West, oriented around these issues. So I really wanted to make a film that reckoned with this notion, and to do that, I wanted to make that focus really small in thinking about this city, and not making a film that you needed a degree in history to. It's like, for me, it's like I got the degree, so you don't have to have the degree. Like I learned stuff so that you don't have to learn it, so that I can make a film that can feed that complexity through a lens where you can understand a really simple story, which is this is not a film about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, as some people say. It's a film about a mayor. It's a film about a fountain. It's a film about Christmas time and how you run the city. And to me, that felt like this sort of microcosmic portrait that I hadn't seen before, that could prioritize your emotional connection to the story rather than your intellectual connection to it.
Yeah, that's a good segue to a question that I wanted to ask you. I mean, the film is so, and I apologize because my radiators are in a bit of a symphony right now. So I'm sorry to those at home. But communications is such a huge theme in the film. There are these scenes where the mayor asks you, do you think they really know what's happening to us here, what we go through here? And then there's also a scene where Hadid is talking to somebody in during a car ride, basically saying, you know, people aren't sitting around thinking about our plight, and the other guy saying, this Nigerian guy embraced me when he learned sort of how we're living here. So, and there's really this question about how do we communicate what we're going through, which I think is a really important question, especially now when we're seeing with what's happening, for example, with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and how it's being adopted in campuses, in governments, in tech, and which makes it very, very difficult, which makes it in some cases next to illegal for Palestinians to actually express what has happened to them and what continues to happen to them. So this question of communications is a really, really big question, obviously. And I know that this is a beautiful film and it's a work of art, and I know that you probably weren't thinking about it necessarily as a piece of political communication or comms, as they say. But I am curious to what extent that was on your mind, without reducing it to sort of like a piece of political propaganda or something.
Oh, well, I mean, to the contrary, I don't see it as a reduction at all. I think that some of the best politics are in art, and some of the best art trends towards the political. And I think what the fascinating bridge between the ideas you're talking about and this film and what I was imagining for it is, that this film's not political unless the act of existence is political, in which case it's very much a political film. And we're talking about a group of people whose existence has been politicized, whose literal existence is up for debate within public discourse. And we're also in a debate where the idea of being morally aligned with Palestinian rights is considered by many, as you said, to be tantamount to anti-Semitism. And the entire world has basically begged Palestine to pursue nonviolent resistance after the Second Intifada, and they did, and they created, a national boycott movement. But the discourse around that even is so negative that there are nations and governmental bodies, including the United States, saying that supporting this nonviolent action is actively hateful towards the predominant religion of an occupying state, right? So I feel like this idea of the conscience being aggravated is something that art does, which is a political gesture, basically. But when it comes to the notion of Palestinian identity, or even 10 steps behind the idea of Palestinian statehood, just a general acknowledgement of the idea that we have a dearth of imagery about Palestine in our minds, even folks who maybe identify closer to me as being somewhat on the left. The fact that we still have these monolithic representations in our head that come from all forms of media, that's political. That's political too. And so I really made this film to add imagery to the idea of what Palestine is. I didn't make the film for Palestinians. I don't think Palestinians need me to make a movie for them. I think Palestinians have appreciated the film, and I've really appreciated their response to it. But I genuinely was more interested in reaching a Western audience who has been unable to parse the details of this part of the world through the noise that is surrounding it when it comes to our media landscape.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking on staff just about how this film seems like it has a certain kind of potential to reach people who may have been resistant to, some of the reality of what's going on in Israel-Palestine. So I totally see that. And I think it's very apparent in the representation of street life in Ramallah. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, I know you've touched on it, but I think there's real time spent in the film on street life, and also on even on highlighting sort of like American businesses and like touchstones that Americans might identify. So I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah,
The character in the film.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I see that as almost, I'll talk about that in kind of conjunction with Musa's character too in the film, which is that Musa is everything that the West would arguably want a Palestinian leader to look like. He wears a suit, he speaks English, he's charming, yeah, he's Christian. That there's a performance of respectability that is, I don't believe, an active performance, and I certainly don't think there's any fault to be ascribed to that performance. It's basically through this ratio of what the world is asking for from Palestinians, but what Palestinians are capable of giving back given the circumstances that are forced onto them. And you see the city blocks of Ramallah. I wanted people to kind of feel the geography of Ramallah when they watch the film. I want you to know that Cafe de la Paix is over there and City Hall is there and the fountain is over here, because I think when you understand the geography and then that geography is defiled in the last act of the film, I think you can feel a different kind of wound that the occupation causes that isn't typically focused on, which is, I think that typical focus when we talk about the occupation is death counts and loss of homes and lands, but the damage to civic pride and the damage to the place that you call home, and also some of the other things that come up in the film, the sewage treatment facility not being able to be built, the cemetery, the lack of a national currency. These are things that, again, even though I knew probably more than most people, was still stunned to hear some of these things upon my first, second, third, fourth visit. And I don't know if you've been to the West Bank, and I'm sure many people here have, but I think we can all agree that when you go the first time, and that you're surprised by a lot of things, and then you come back and you tell people, and they're surprised too. And you brought up my film, Thank You for Playing, which was about an evangelical family, evangelical Christian family. And I remember talking to them because we're still friends. And I remember talking to them when I first started filming, and I was explaining the Christmas stuff and everything, and they were stunned to hear that there were Christians in Palestine. It wasn't reconciled with what they had heard and what they understood. This is a very long-winded answer to your question about space and the city streets, but I think that for me, I wanted to give you a sense of almost displacement in the first 5 minutes. So like, where am I? What is this? And the music's doing that in the film too. You're hearing music from all over the world. You're hearing classical music. You're hearing folk music from Chad, from Georgia, the country Georgia, from Korea, from Japan. What you're not hearing is the oud playing. What you're not seeing is the sunrise over a sand dune with a camel. Like I'm trying to give you a different representation to break down as much as possible within a film your preconceptions, so that you have this fertile, plowed land that you can plant some new ideas into. And that's Musa's city, that's Musa's world, and the film is trying to just show you his vision of Ramallah, what he's trying to do with the city.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you, you have incredible access to him, and it seems almost completely unfettered within the span of those couple weeks, or I'm not really sure how long.
About 2 years.
2 years. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the action is in
span of a year. Yeah, it goes between the two Christmas times. Yeah.
So, I mean, were there any points of contention, like any place where he was kind of like back off, or was it pretty, was he pretty, open door policy about everything?
He never asked me to stop filming anything, really. There were times when I could tell that it was time to stop. I filmed about 350 hours of footage for the film. The film's 89 minutes, so you can do the math. There's a lot that's not in the movie, and a lot of that is meetings. A lot of that is other characters that I cut from the film. The film originally had this sort of Altman-esque cast of supporting characters, council members, other people in Ramallah, Architecture Heritage Foundation organizations in Ramallah, filmed in nursing homes, filmed in the refugee camps that surround Ramallah, filmed a lot more outside of the city, on the fringes of the city, working people, municipal laborers, all sorts of stuff. I think at first I was thinking I want to make as kaleidoscopic of a portrait as possible. And also, this is also just the way I make films. I'm thinking, well, what excites me? What gets me excited about what I've got? And I always kept coming back to Musa.
Mhm.
And I mean, our relationship took a long time to develop, but it had to be a relationship. Like I really hate the idea of fly on the wall filmmaking. I'm not a fly. Like I'm obviously there. Like and there's of course there's a moment in the film where I kind of nod to my presence as a person, because I think you're kind of wondering it in the back of your mind if I don't. Um, like what's going on, why is this guy named David making this movie? And I feel like there's just little things like that. It's just like that's the thing that's beautiful about documentary work to me. Nonfiction filmmaking is reality is part of the story sometimes, but are we I mean it's I feel like maybe it took a year for Musa and I to become simpatico, you know, to get to a place where we really had a good working relationship, and I got to know his family and befriended his family and go out to drinks a bunch with his son. And I mean, I have to have a relationship with the people I'm filming because I see them as collaborators. And
Mhm.
Musa and I, by the end, I really saw that I mean, we were doing the same thing, interestingly. You know, like his job, as he sees it, part of his job is to show Ramallah to the rest of the world and showcase his city and to be an ambassador to a degree. The film's job was also to show Ramallah to the world through his eyes. So we had the same mission. I just had the camera, and it was a. I think the film couldn't have succeeded if we didn't have a good working relationship.
So this is a good segue to my next question. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of comedy in the film, and particularly also how it relates to like the film being made by someone named David, as you said. Um, you know, I actually I've seen people talk about the film as a dark comedy, but I almost feel like that's not accurate in a certain sense, because it does feel to me like the comedy and the tragedy are sort of separate. Like I don't feel a lot of moments where they're working together in the same moment. And I feel also that in my experience early in the film, I was almost uncomfortable laughing because I wondered a bit about whether I was laughing at him or whether the film was laughing at him. There was sort of like this question. So, and then there was also an experience of recognizing, for example, I saw, you know, a young Palestinian academic on Twitter basically saying, you know, I don't find this film funny at all. What is funny about this film? It's traumatizing, you know? So I'm sort of curious about how you think about the way comedy functions in the film and sort of balancing, um, you know, these two very different registers on the one hand, and also the question of, you know, what are we laughing at and how, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that to the contrary, the humor and the tragedy in this film are actually working against each other,
Mhm.
which I think is partly the reason for the comedy. I mean, even calling it comedies is strange. I think that, you know, it was really important to me to make sure that you're
Funniness,
not. Sorry.
the funniness.
Yeah, yeah. I think, you know, it was important to me to make sure you don't feel like you're laughing at anybody. And there were a couple things that I did to try to belay that. But I think that also the film has a bit of an evolution to it, in several aspects. And part of which, I guess, to exemplify this, and then we could talk about it a little bit more specifically, you know, in the first 20 minutes of the film, you're seeing, you know, these parkouring Santa Clauses in a, you know, in a flash mob. And I think you're probably thinking to yourself the same thing that I was probably thinking to myself, which is this seems like a very strange way to spend your time if you're the mayor of Ramallah. Like this doesn't, but it was in fact the way that he was spending his time, and I wanted to dive into that and understand it. But then I think by the end of the film, when the fountain becomes this sort of character and a symbol, I think you're starting to understand that these things are actually symbols of resistance. Like these civic acts are actually means through which to assert your dignity and pride. And I I needed that evolution to be complete. And I think that an evolution can't, I mean, I can't bake everything in with that to the beginning of the film with that, and then there's no journey. So for me, the comedic moments are places where I think you find some common ground, but also I was thinking a lot about, you know, my favorite satirists, and I was thinking about like Armando Iannucci, who made Veep and In the Loop, and he would always define satire as like a series of accepted conventions, and satire is when you point out the departure from those conventions. And the way I interpreted that when it came to this film was we all know how civic government works. We all have mayors. We all live in places. So we all know the banality of and the bureaucracy. But what happens when that bubble gets pierced by the mechanism of a military occupation? And I saw the tweet you're talking about, and I would love to have a conversation with that academic, because for me, I don't find anything funny about the occupation, but I also remind myself of, losing a loved one to cancer and using humor as a coping mechanism, which is something that I know a lot of my Palestinian friends are searching for endlessly when it comes to being able to get through, some of the horrific mundanity of how ubiquitous and endless the occupation is. And there's another huge inspiration for this film, frankly, was a work of a Palestinian filmmaker named Elia Suleiman, who made this film called Divine Intervention, which is a completely farcical, absurdist like romp through the West Bank, with incredibly absurd images and tons of poking fun at self and at experiences, and almost like a Jacques Tati movie in some ways, like Playtime, and I which is a great movie, by the way, if anyone hasn't seen it. But I think to myself, like, the comedy in this film is not to just make you laugh. It's that when that humor breaks, I think it reveals even more of the tragedy. I think that when you're ensconced in this cocoon of, oh, this is just a film about local government and it's silly and there's this and there's that, but then all these things can't function because of the occupation. When the rules of the film change all of a sudden, I think it's even more alarming. And I think that we're used to, again, we're used to these issues being discussed um, in such a clear nod of manner of, it's bad and I know it's bad, so let's talk to each other about how bad it is. I think that I lose a chance to connect to a new audience if I stay inside of a narrative that I'm familiar with, and I think that you should be too. And again, basically, I mean, I made the film to appeal to audiences that wouldn't otherwise maybe click on it.
I have a few more questions, but I also wanted to invite people to put a few questions in the chat if you like. And I won't be able to get to all of them, but if you do have a question that isn't being answered, by all means. And yeah, so I wanted to talk, bouncing off of what you just said, I also wanted to talk a bit about that climactic scene. And I was wondering if I could use you for a minute to explain to people in our audience who might not understand the way that Ramallah is situated vis-a-vis the kind of mechanics of the occupation. So Ramallah, of course, is in Area A, which is a designation under the Oslo Accords that has to do with kind of different varying levels of autonomy, which I'm putting a bit in scare quotes. And so I just was curious about, in that last scene, if you could help contextualize what we're seeing a bit also from the standpoint of the way that the occupation is felt, particularly in a place like Ramallah, which is in Area A. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. So Area A, meaning it's under the autonomy, allegedly, quotes, like you said, of the Palestinian Authority. There's other areas B and C, which are either mixed or under the control of of Israeli authorities. Um, so Ramallah, is alleged technically is Palestine, like it's under its own control, but except that it's not really. And what you see happening in the film is a sewage treatment plant can't be built because public health mandates that a sewage treatment plant be X number of meters away from people. They can't build X numbers of meters away without approval, because X number of meters away is now in Area C, which requires joint approval from both authorities. Cemetery, not land to build it, things like that. Freedom of movement between the areas, under which jurisdiction. It becomes more difficult. And so Ramallah has become the de facto capital because of the presence of the Palestinian Authority, but it's about 10 miles away from Jerusalem. You can see Jerusalem from the hills, you can see Tel Aviv from the hills, you can see the ocean on a clear day. But all that to say is, um, I mean, what you see happening in the film is basically illegal, according to international law. You know, soldiers may not, under the Oslo Accords, come into Ramallah at any given moment to their own whim to just seize anything, people, footage, whatever. That it's as illegal as the settlements which are surrounding Ramallah, which are also illegal under international law since 1967. So there's what you're seeing is a flagrant violation of what's been agreed to. But I would argue personally that in the last 4 years, especially, there has been a basic abandonment um, of scruples by the occupation in terms of how they've been either had their feet held to the fire for breaking some of these rules, or any repercussions that might follow. And I think if you ask 10 Palestinians, has the occupation been emboldened by the Trump administration? I think 10 would reply in the affirmative. And so what you're seeing, there's regularly incursions militarily into Ramallah at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. when no one's there in the outskirts. But this was at, 7 o'clock at night, downtown Ramallah, dinner time. These restaurants are expensive. This is Fifth Avenue of Ramallah, basically, and you're seeing this happen. That was probably wouldn't have happened 4 years ago.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you about the moment. It's a very fleeting moment in the film where he's talking to some constituents and they say to him, are you Fatah or are you Hamas? And I think he says that he's PFLP, which is completely defunct.
It's a joke.
It's a joke. It's a defunct organization. And I mean, what we're seeing, of course, is that the Palestinian political project, is particularly for a Palestinian state, is really stalled. The two-state solution is basically dead. And Palestinian thinkers and political leaders are really struggling to figure out sort of what's next, what's their next move. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about Hadid's particular relationship to the political situation, because he really is portrayed in some ways as an apolitical character. I mean, again, I think you're right in saying that that his existence itself is political and politicized, and it's not that he doesn't wade into the fray at all in the film. We do see him make certain decisions, but I'm just curious how, I mean, because that's really resisted in the film in terms of what his political identity is, or how he participates in a certain kind of visioning for what's next in Palestine. If you had anything to reveal about that, not like straightforwardly about his political leanings, but just sort of broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I have too much that I could really reveal, except that he's in the Fatah political party, which is the dominant party of the West Bank. I don't personally think that he'd want to run for any higher office. I think, especially when he's done with his term at the end of this year, I think he's ready for a break, for a little while at least. But there's not much that I even could say whether it's. I don't really have many details about what his political leanings are, except that I know that he, as a Christian in Ramallah, has been in Fatah for his life. Many of his colleagues and friends have been in Fatah for their lives. You see a lot of council members who were former PFLP members. There's people within his circle who are more to the left of him, more to the right of him. I would argue that he's sort of a center-left politician as far as Palestinian politicians go. There's, of course, people who are far more to his left, as members of the now defunct PFLP would be. But Musa's general interests seem to me have always been orbiting around his city. He's the consummate local politician. He is deeply oriented around the life and vitality and identity of Ramallah, and sees himself very much as a son of Ramallah. And I think that is ultimately, aside from his loyalty to Palestine, the most important political post that he'll have.
Cool. I'm going to take some viewer questions. One of them is about, really straightforwardly, we touched a little bit on this, maybe obliquely, but the question of making this film as a non-Palestinian, and the delicacy of that. If you could.
Yeah, I mean, for there were years between me working on Off Frame, the documentary I edited, and making this film, where I would think to myself, oh, this would be a great film, this would be a great film, that would be a great film, but I'm not the one to make it because I'm not Palestinian. uh doesn't there would be no reason for me to make this except for the fact that I could technically, like, I could go in and make a film and come out. But with this film, I mean, by this point, I had done a year of research before I started filming. I have friends and contacts in Ramallah, in the U.S., Palestinians in the U.S., kind of a team of colleagues, who and sounding boards who I could talk to. And I knew that for a film like this, particularly as an American, I actually felt like it would be an interesting way to approach the story, because I wasn't making a film about Palestinian identity. I was making a film about the mayor of a city who was trying to reach the West, and his difficulty in doing that while also trying to run his city. And it felt to me like, okay, that was the first step. Like, does this feel responsible as a non-Palestinian to make this film? And it felt to me, yes, it did. It felt like it would be okay. But I also really wanted to make sure that I wasn't taking away space from anybody else. And so I asked around, I was like, has anyone ever tried to make this movie? A lot of Palestinian friends of mine would laugh at the idea of the movie. They'd be like, no, of course not. Like, we don't care about the mayor of Ramallah. Like, a movie about the mayor of Ramallah, this sounds boring. Like, he doesn't do, he just does the festivals. Like, he just does the streets. And so, I mean, that was like another kind of stamp of approval, was like, okay, like that's okay. Like, so I feel like, along the way, I kept kind of challenging myself and making sure that I felt as though I was doing something that felt morally acceptable to me, and tried to keep as many contacts open with my Palestinian colleagues who would tell me if I was messing up and tell me if I had to back away. It got a lot easier, frankly, for me to manage these feelings once I narrowed my focus to Musa. Once I stopped trying to make this kaleidoscopic portrait of Ramallah that included all these disparate angles, once I started to talk to myself and say to myself the truth, which is that I was making a film about Ramallah through Musa's eyes and through the eyes of a single person. He's not the spokesperson for Ramallah in any way, like, just like I'm not the spokesperson for Ramallah. I would hate if someone watches this film and thinks that they understand everything. You know, that's not the point of films to me. And that's why, to answer someone else's question, that's why I don't say certain things. That's why there's certain things you don't know. That's why I don't go into Musa's backstory. I had a scene early on, an early rough cut of the film, where I had his little backstory. He used to run a dairy factory in the first Intifada. He was incarcerated, like many Palestinians were in the first Intifada, as like a protester. And then he got out of prison, started commercial work again, and then became mayor. And I left that out because I think Americans have a really complicated relationship to the idea of incarceration. And I think that it's a really fraught relationship. And I think as soon as I say that, that's all you think about. And that ruins, like, I mean this word in a really loving sense. It ruined the fable. I felt like I was trying to make a fable, a simple story in a complex place. And through making a simple story in a complex place, you can latch on to the things that move you, not the things that you say to yourself, oh, I didn't know that. That comes through naturally. And I wanted to ground the film in what I didn't know. And as a result of that, I felt like ultimately I could walk on ground that didn't feel like I was parachuting in. And that's the other thing, is just like I wasn't. I mean, I had an apartment. I wasn't going to be like some other filmmakers might be and just show up for 2 weeks and leave. I had relationships with people. My partner came to visit me once while I was filming, and Ramallah is small. You can walk across the length of it in like 25, 35 minutes. And I think we were walking to a restaurant and like 4 different people stopped and waved. And she was like, "Are you famous here?" But it is that kind of city. Like I don't think this would have worked if I was making a film about a city that was the size of, of Indianapolis or something. Like even something slightly larger, it would have been very difficult. But Ramallah is so small, and you can have real, genuine connections with people, and they could understand what I wanted to do and what my goal was. And I would talk to people, put the camera down, tell them what I wanted to do, why I was there. So I really tried to do everything I could to not feel like I was just parachuting in.
Mhm. Thanks for that. Uh, I'm just going to ask maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll uh, remind people how they can watch the film in case they haven't. Um, the I do want to ask, somebody is asking on here basically about audience, about both about whether it's more difficult to get these films, a film about Palestine made and seen, and also whether it's more difficult to sort of gain a willing audience for this kind of film. So I'm curious. I mean, I know that the film has basically just come out, but if you have any sense of its reception in that regard, and whether there is like more room in this space for more films like this.
I would love to think there's more space for films like this, but my job is to make the movies. I'm not good at the part where it's, how do we open up communities, and that's one of the reasons that it's great to do things like this, because I can share the film with people who have ideas, who have networks, who have synagogues, who have mosques, who have churches, who have communities, who have foundations, who are interested in this kind of film. I'm grateful that I've been able to partner with some wonderful organizations to get the film out and to distribute it. Obviously, it's a very hard year to do that. This would have been much different if this were a normal year. If this were a normal year, you'd be able to see the film in theaters right now. It's going to be on public television at the end of next year. There's going to be streaming in between. It's already available worldwide. So that's that. I can build it, and I can try to create the movie itself, but in terms of what the audience is for it, the best thing that I can do is share it to people like yourselves.
Cool. I think that that is a good place to stop. There are a lot of good questions, but I feel like I want to end on this note. Um, Can you remind us how we can watch the film in addition? I mean, if you've signed up, just to remind everyone, if you've signed up for this Q&A, you've gotten a link or a discount code to watch the film at Film Forum, and that will be available until the end of the month. And then after the end of the month, David will tell us what to do to watch the film.
Yeah, so the film will be available through the virtual cinemas, and you can also see other ones if there's local cinemas near you that you want to support at mayorfilm.com. And towards the end of January, there's probably going to still be some other ones that are available nationwide. So if you keep visiting mayorfilm.com and you see that list of virtual cinemas, you can see a place where the link's available for you. And then mid-February, the film also through mayorfilm.com. From mid-February on, the film will be available on like iTunes and YouTube, Vimeo, things like that. The film's already available worldwide that way, and so that'll be the best way to see it.
Great. Thank you so much, David, for making this film and also for joining us in this conversation. And I think that's it.
Thanks so much for having me. And if I didn't get to your question, you can email me. Happy to answer your question. It's just my name at Gmail. Happy to answer anything.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.